Alistair Vance secretly follows a quiet schoolgirl he spots near a condemned building his company owns. For 7 days, the CEO keeps watching her return to the same crumbling structure, calm, purposeful, carrying things inside. When he finally discovers the truth of what she is doing there, it shatters the empire of indifference he has spent his entire life building, and forces him to face the precise moment his humanity went silent. One single decision will change everything. Before we begin, tell us in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. Let's begin. Alistair Vance learned about power when he was 9 years old. Not the kind that comes from money or titles or corner offices. The other kind. The kind that is taken from you quietly, without announcement, without apology, when someone with a pen and a suit decides your family is a number that no longer adds up. His father, Ronald Vance, was a steelworker who lost his job in a single Monday morning meeting. No severance. No warning. Just a manila envelope and a walk to the parking lot. Alistair remembered standing at the kitchen window that evening, watching his father sit in the car for 2 hours without coming inside. He never fully came back inside after that, not really. He was present in body, absent in everything that mattered. And his mother, Diane, became the spine of a household that had forgotten how to stand straight. She took in ironing. She babysat neighbors' children before sunrise. She smiled at parent-teacher evenings in shoes that had been resoled twice, so that no teacher would look at her son with that particular, devastating softness that poor children learn to recognize before they learn long division. Alistair watched all of it. He catalogued it. And somewhere between his father's silence and his mother's performance of dignity, he made a decision that a boy his age had no business making. He would never be in that position. He would never be the man in the car. He would never need anyone's mercy, anyone's softness, anyone's pity. He would become the man with the pen. And he did. By 44, Alistair Vance ran Vance Capital, a private equity firm responsible for redeveloping 12 city blocks across 3 states. He wore his suits like a second skeleton. He made decisions that affected hundreds of lives with the same emotional expenditure most men reserve for choosing a coffee order. His staff called him precise. His rivals called him cold. His ex-wife, in the single honest conversation they had during their divorce proceedings, called him gone, not cruel, she said, just completely, quietly gone. He had not thought about his father in the parking lot for 30 years. He had not thought about his mother's resold shoes in longer. He had not thought about any of it, until the morning a 15-year-old girl sat down on the steps of a building he intended to demolish, opened a book, and refused to move. Alistair Vance did not just enter a boardroom, he annexed it. Standing at the head of a mahogany table that cost more than most mid-sized sedans, he adjusted his silk tie with the clinical precision of a surgeon. Around him, the air seemed to drop 10 degrees. To the city, he was the man who never flinches, a billionaire architect of industry who had spent 20 years perfecting an emotional frost that kept everyone, competitors and allies alike, at a permanent distance. Today's objective was the $40 million East Side redevelopment project. It was a deal that would cement his legacy, turning a series of crumbling city blocks into a gleaming glass monument to his own name. As the presentation flickered across the screen, showing the demolition of low-value structures, Alistair's eyes remained as cold and unyielding as the $80,000 watch on his wrist. He had built an empire from the scorched earth of his own past, swearing beside a forgotten grave 2 decades ago that he would never again be the person who had to look at the price of a meal or the cost of a doctor's visit. The demolition begins in 48 hours, Alistair stated, his voice a low rhythmic vibration that commanded absolute silence. I want the residents cleared. No delays. No sentimentality. Efficiency is the only currency I recognize. His lead developer shifted uncomfortably. Sir, there's a small community school right in the center of the zone. The local families are pleading for a grace period. They say it's the only safe place left for the children in the East Side. Alistair didn't even look up from his tablet. Sentiment is a luxury for those who can afford to lose. I cannot. Proceed as scheduled. He had everything: the penthouse, the luxury cars, and a reputation that struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. But as he walked out of the building, the $1,500 Italian leather of his shoes clicking against the pavement, a hollow ache began to throb in his chest, one he had spent 20 years trying to ignore. He was a man who had won the world, but had forgotten how to see the souls inhabiting it. His driver opened the door to the armored SUV, but Alistair paused. Across the street, near the edge of his pristine construction site, a quiet schoolgirl in a frayed uniform was kneeling in the dirt. She wasn't playing. She was carefully sorting through a pile of discarded debris from a preliminary demolition, her small hands moving with a desperate, familiar rhythm that sent a sudden, violent jolt through Alistair's heart. The girl looked up, and for a split second, her eyes met his. They weren't the eyes of a child. They were the eyes of a survivor who had already learned that the world was a predatory place. As she clutched a heavy rusted metal box to her chest and darted into the shadows of the very alleyway Alistair had just ordered to be leveled, a cold sweat broke across his neck. The $40 million deal was a heartbeat away from completion, but as he watched the girl disappear into the low-value ruins, a terrifying realization dawned on him. The girl wasn't just a stranger. She was heading toward the exact coordinates where the bulldozers were set to strike first, and the look in her eyes suggested she wasn't just hiding there, she was protecting something he had spent 20 years trying to bury. The morning of the demolition arrived with the roar of diesel engines and the smell of exhaust that choked the humid east side air. Alistair Vance stood at the edge of the perimeter, his tailored charcoal suit a stark, clinical contrast to the dust-caked pavement. Huge yellow excavators, looking like prehistoric beasts, sat idling, their hydraulic arms poised to tear into the brick and mortar of the community center. The site manager, a man named Miller with sweat-beaded brows, gripped his radio so tightly his knuckles were white. He looked at Alistair, then back at the center's front steps, and hesitated. "Sir, we have a problem," Miller shouted over the mechanical growl. "She hasn't moved. Not for an hour." Alistair followed the man's gaze and felt a strange, cold pressure in his chest. Maya Zora sat on the cracked concrete steps, her small frame dwarfed by the massive steel doors behind her. She was calm, unnervingly so. While the neighborhood around her was a frantic mess of shouting protesters and police lines, Maya remained a statue of quiet defiance, her nose buried in a tattered book. There was an immovable quality to her stillness, a dignified weight that Alistair had never encountered in any high-stakes boardroom. "Move her," Alistair commanded, though his voice lacked its usual razor-edged certainty. "We tried, Mr. Vance. The police tried. She doesn't scream. She doesn't fight. She just stays," Miller replied, his voice cracking. "The crews are getting jumpy. They say it feels like bad luck." Alistair stepped over the yellow caution tape, his $1,500 shoes crunching on broken glass. Every step closer to the girl felt like a step back into a past he had spent 25 years trying to bury, a past defined by women who stood their ground when the world tried to bulldoze them. As he reached the foot of the stairs, the shadow of a demolition crane swung over them, blotting out the sun. The high-pitched whine of a saw started nearby, escalating the tension until the air felt ready to snap. "The building is coming down, Maya," Alistair said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous vibration. "You're smart enough to know that your presence won't stop a $40 million contract." Maya didn't look up immediately. She turned a page with a slow, deliberate motion that made the idling engine seem to fade into the background. When she finally raised her head, her dark eyes didn't hold fear or the desperation of the poor. They held a piercing, ancient intelligence that made Alistair feel like the one who was exposed. "The contract says you own the land, Mr. Vance," she said softly, her voice carrying through the mechanical din, "but it doesn't say you own what's underneath it. And you won't touch this building until you admit why you're really here." Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped animal. The escalation of the machines reached a fever pitch as Miller signaled the lead crane to position its wrecking ball. The ground began to vibrate, a low-frequency shudder that signaled the start of the end. "Give the order, sir." Miller screamed over the roar. "We're on the clock." Alistair looked at the girl, then at the heavy rusted box she had tucked behind her on the step, the same box he had seen her scavenge from the ruins the day before. Just as he opened his mouth to command the strike, Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out a faded, laminated ID badge that had been scorched at the edges. She slid it across the concrete toward his shoes. Alistair froze. The face on the badge wasn't Maya's. It was a woman from 20 years ago, wearing the same uniform his mother had worn the day she disappeared, and the name printed on it was the one secret Alistair had paid millions to erase from every public record in the state. The wrecking ball stayed suspended like a giant's pendulum, frozen by the sight of a scorched ID badge that shouldn't exist. Alistair Vance did not cancel the demolition. He merely suspended it, buying himself 7 days of a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight. For 1 week, the $40 million project sat in a state of expensive paralysis while its architect became a ghost. Before the sun could touch the glass spires of the city, Alistair was already in the east side, his armored SUV replaced by a nondescript sedan, his $80,000 watch hidden beneath the sleeve of a common jacket. Each morning at 5:15, he watched Maya emerge from the shadow of the condemned community center. She moved with a calculated rhythmic dignity that bypassed her youth, shepherding a group of smaller children through the debris-strewn streets like a seasoned guardian. On day 2, he watched her at the corner market, her brow furrowed in a silent, mathematical battle as she counted nickels to stretch a single bag of rice and 3 bruised apples for a group that clearly hadn't eaten since the previous noon. It was a performance of grace for an audience of no one, a quiet defiance against the hunger that Alistair knew bit like a living beast. By day 4, the stakes escalated from observation to a haunting. His board of directors was screaming for progress, their messages vibrating against his thigh like a frantic heartbeat, but Alistair was busy watching Maya navigate a world of nothing. He saw her mend a younger boy's shoe with duct tape and a scrap of rubber, her yellow gloves, cheap translucent things, moving with the same reverence his mother used when dividing their last meal. Every time she looked toward his hidden car, Alistair felt his custom-made armor cracking. He wasn't just watching a schoolgirl, he was watching a living memory of everything he had sacrificed to become a king. On day 6, the atmospheric pressure of the neighborhood reached a breaking point. A rival developer's crew, tired of the delays, began harassing the locals near the center. Maya didn't flinch. She stood between a shouting foreman and a crying child, her stillness so absolute it made the foreman's aggression look like cowardice. Watching her, Alistair felt a sickening surge of vertigo. He realized he had spent 20 years running from the ghost of a woman who worked herself to death, only to find her reincarnated in the very girl he was supposed to displace. On the 7th night, the silence finally shattered. Alistair followed Maya not to the center, but to a hidden sub-basement beneath the ruins, a place not marked on any of his $40 million blueprints. As she descended, clutching the rusted metal box, Alistair crept into the darkness behind her, the smell of damp earth and old secrets filling his lungs. He reached the bottom just as Maya knelt before a heavy steel door and whispered a name into the dark, a name that caused Alistair's heart to stop cold. From behind the door came a muffled rhythmic tapping, and as the heavy bolts began to slide back, the light of Maya's flashlight hit a wall of old, archived files. Every single box was labeled with the same name as the ID badge, the name of the mother Alistair thought had died in a hospital bed 20 years ago. The basement was a labyrinth of damp stone and forgotten echoes, but as Alistair moved deeper into the shadows of the community center, the cold industrial air began to shift. He pressed himself against a soot-stained window that overlooked a hidden gymnasium, and the breath died in his throat. Inside, the low-value ruin had been transformed into a sanctuary of impossible warmth. This wasn't a squatter's den, it was a cathedral of survival. Maya stood at the front of a cracked chalkboard, her small hands moving with a fluid, teacher-like grace as she drew shimmering constellations in white chalk. Surrounded by a dozen younger children, she wasn't the immovable statue from the steps or the desperate scavenger in the dirt. She was a sun around which they all orbited. She began to read aloud, her voice a melodic anchor in the rising storm of the city outside. For the first time in 7 days of surveillance, Alistair saw her laugh, a bright, crystalline sound that felt like a physical blow to his chest. It was the sound of a joy that didn't require a $40 million budget or a silk-lined suit to exist. Every word she spoke, every constellation she mapped, chipped away at the emotional frost Alistair had cultivated for 20 years. He watched her hand a small girl a piece of bread with the same reverence one might handle a holy relic, her yellow rubber gloves now looking like a knight's gauntlets. The high stakes of his redevelopment project, the legacy, the profit, the power, suddenly felt like a pile of ash. He had called these people delays in his boardroom, but here, in the glow of a few flickering lanterns, he realized they were the only things in the East Side that were truly alive. The justification for his mission didn't just crumble, it vanished. He was the villain in this story, the man coming to extinguish the only light these children had left. But as his heart finally broke open, the sound of a heavy metallic thud echoed from the street above. The escalation was no longer a slow burn, it was a forest fire. Miller had ignored the suspension. The roar of a bulldozer surged to a deafening pitch, and the very ground beneath the basement began to groan and shudder. Alistair looked from the laughing children to the ceiling as a hairline crack raced across the concrete. He reached for his radio to scream a ceasefire, but his hand froze as he saw Maya's face turn pale. She didn't look at the ceiling. She looked at the heavy steel door at the back of the gym, the one Alistair had seen her whisper to earlier. A frantic, rhythmic pounding started from the other side of that door, followed by a voice that sounded like a ghost reaching out from a grave. "Alistair," the voice cried out, muffled but unmistakable. "Is someone there? Please, the water is rising." It was his mother's voice, identical to the one he had buried 20 years ago, and she was trapped on the other side of the wall he had just ordered to be destroyed. The demolition sirens had long since faded into a haunting silence, leaving the east side shrouded in a thick, expectant fog. Alistair Vance stood alone before the community center, his breath hitching in the cold air. The suspension of the project was costing him millions by the hour. His phone was a graveyard of missed calls and legal threats from a board of directors ready to mutiny. But the man who never flinches was no longer looking at balance sheets. He gripped a flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness like a blade as he stepped over the threshold into the condemned sanctuary. Inside, the air smelled of old paper, chalk dust, and the lingering scent of the bread Maya had shared with the children. Alistair moved through the makeshift classroom, his footsteps echoing like gunshots against the floorboards. He saw the textbooks stacked with obsessive care, their spines taped together by hands that refused to let knowledge be discarded as trash. He ran a thumb over a handwritten schedule taped to a desk, a rigorous plan for math, history, and hope written in the same determined script he had seen on the ID badge. Every detail was a violent escalation of his guilt. He wasn't destroying a low-value structure, he was dismantling a miracle built on the edge of nothing. His flashlight swept across the chalkboard, illuminating the constellations Maya had drawn. They looked like a map to a world he had forgotten existed, a world where worth wasn't measured in $80,000 watches, but in the courage to stay still when the bulldozers arrived. The stakes of his life's work felt suddenly, sickeningly small. He had built an empire of glass and steel to escape his own ghost, yet here, in the heart of the ruins, the ghost was screaming for his attention. The beam of his light climbed higher, snagging on a small tarnished silver frame perched above the chalkboard. It was the only thing in the room that looked like a treasure. Alistair stepped closer, his pulse thundering in his ears, a rhythmic roar that drowned out the distant city traffic. He tilted the light, and the glare vanished to reveal a faded photograph from 20 years ago. The blood drained from his face so rapidly he felt the world tilt. In the photo, a young woman stood in a blue medical uniform, her arm wrapped around a small red-haired boy with a gap-toothed smile. It wasn't just a resemblance. He knew that uniform. He knew that exhausted, loving smile that had once pretended she wasn't hungry just so he could eat. It was Margaret. It was his mother. But his eyes locked onto the girl standing on the other side of the boy, a younger version of the woman he had followed for 7 days, her hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. Alistair didn't scream. He didn't speak. The realization hit him with the force of a wrecking ball, shattering the final remains of his carefully constructed armor. The secret wasn't that Maya was a stranger. The secret was that she was the only family he had left, holding the piece of his soul he thought had died in the mud 2 decades ago. The $40 million project wasn't just a business deal anymore. It was a murder-suicide of his own history. His knees hit the floor with a bone-jarring thud, the sound of a heavy wooden chair scraping across the concrete as his legs finally gave out under the weight of a truth he was never meant to find. Alistair sat on the cold floor of the ruins, the rusted metal box Maya had scavenged now open before him. His trembling hands sorted through the contents, not trash, but a meticulously kept archive of a tragedy he had authored. He found it near the bottom, a termination notice from his own company, Vance Restructuring, dated 20 years ago. The signature at the bottom was a sharp, arrogant scrawl that had taken him less than 4 seconds to write. It was one of thousands of efficiency cuts he had authorized to protect his first million, a decision made without looking up from his mahogany desk. The timeline reconstructed itself in his mind with the violence of a high-speed collision. That 4-second signature had revoked the health insurance of a woman who was already swaying like a tree in the wind from exhaustion. Because of that signature, she couldn't afford to miss work to go to the doctor when the first pains started. He traced the documents further, the eviction notices, the mounting medical debt, and finally, the death certificate that listed a preventable illness as the cause. He hadn't just lost his mother to fate, he had fired her into her grave. The escalation of his horror peaked as he realized the identity of the daughter left behind. Maya wasn't just a ghost, she was the living invoice for his indifference. While he was building an empire from hunger and determination, Maya was the one left to carry the weight of the world in yellow gloves. Every time he had fired employees for taking food without permission, he was repeating the very act that had destroyed his own family. The $40 million project was the ultimate irony. He was literally tearing down the last sanctuary of the girl who had survived the poverty he created. The emotional frost that had kept him untouchable for 2 decades evaporated, replaced by a searing, suffocating shame. He realized that the armor hadn't protected him, it had blinded him. He had become the very monster his younger self had sworn to defeat. He looked at his $80,000 watch. It didn't just tell time, it counted the seconds of life he had stolen from his own blood. Suddenly, the silence was shattered by a sharp electronic chirp from his pocket. It was a high-priority alert from the site manager, Miller. "Sir, the board has bypassed your suspension. They've classified the community center as an immediate public safety hazard. The secondary crew is already at the perimeter with the industrial chargers." Alistair's heart hammered against his ribs as he looked at the screen. Below the message was a live feed of the site. The heavy excavators were no longer idling. They were moving toward the front steps where Maya sat alone, her book closed, her gaze fixed on the mechanical beasts as they raised their steel claws for the final strike. The call to his legal team took 11 minutes. The call to halt the demolition took 45 seconds. Alistair made both from the parking lot of the community center, standing beside his car in the early morning cold, still wearing yesterday's shirt. He had not slept. Not because he couldn't. He had trained himself over 2 decades to sleep efficiently, strategically, like a machine entering low-power mode. He hadn't slept because every time he closed his eyes, he saw the photograph. Her mother's face. That particular, specific face. And beneath it, in Maya's careful handwriting, a single line he had stood in the dark reading for a long time. She worked hard and loved harder. We do not forget. The trust was established by Thursday. Alistair's attorneys moved with the quiet practice speed of people paid to make complicated things disappear cleanly. A permanent legal endowment. The building transferred out of Vance Capital's portfolio and into a non-profit structure that would protect it from any future acquisition, including his own. Renovations funded. A small salary established for a building coordinator. The document ran to 41 pages. Alistair read every word of it himself, which he had not done with a contract in years. He named it the Celestine Zora Community Trust. Celestine. Maya's mother. The woman whose name he had never known when he signed the restructuring order that removed her from the payroll. The woman who had a daughter. The woman who, it turned out, had been more than a line item, had been, in fact, the entire load-bearing wall of a family that was still standing only because a 15-year-old girl had refused to let it fall. He sat with the signed documents for a long time before he moved. Here was the thing that no attorney could resolve, no trust fund could correct, no 41-page document could address. Maya did not know. She knew a CEO had halted the demolition. She knew the building was safe. His project manager had delivered that news through official channels, clean and impersonal, the way Alistair had always preferred information to travel. She had no reason to connect any of it to the silver-haired man she had seen exactly once, standing at the edge of a parking lot, watching her with an expression she probably couldn't name. She did not know that the man who saved the building was the same man who had, years earlier, quietly destroyed the foundation of her life. That was the question that had kept him awake for 4 nights running. Not a business question. Not a legal question. A human one, the kind he had spent 20 years making himself too efficient to ask. Did she deserve the truth? Or did she deserve peace? Were those the same thing? Were they mutually exclusive? Was his need to confess about her healing, or his own? He drove to the community center on a Saturday morning without fully deciding. He told himself he was checking on the renovation assessment. He was not checking on the renovation assessment. She was there. Of course she was. Sitting on the same steps where he had first seen her 11 days ago. Same posture, same stillness, same quality of quiet that had stopped a demolition crew and cracked open a man who had not cracked in 2 decades. She had a book open in her lap. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. She did not look away. Alistair stopped walking. The morning was very still. Somewhere behind him, a city went about its business, indifferent and unaware. He opened his mouth. And in the half-second before the words came, or didn't, everything that had ever been taken from her, and everything he had ever taken from himself, hung suspended in the air between them.